Well, welcome everyone to the Kimberlite webinar for artificial lift and production chemicals. My name is David Batt. I'm the president of Kimberlite Research, and I'm glad that you're able to join us today. This is the third in the series of Kimberlite webinars. Our first webinar in June provided an update on drilling services, and in August we hosted a webinar on hydraulic fracturing services. If you or any of your colleagues need access to the drilling services or hydraulic fracturing webinar, we can provide that for you. Just simply drop us an email or a chat message today. For those of you that are not as familiar with Kimberlite Research, I'll provide a brief background and then dive into the 2020 artificial lift and production chemical reports. At Kimberlite Research, we provide voice of customer feedback each year via personal phone interviews with nearly 3,000 E&P operators worldwide. Some of you on the webinar with us today are colleagues you may know, may have participated in one of our studies in the past, and for that we say thank you for that. Our research is approximately 50% North America and 50% international. We produce a series of reports crossing formation evaluation, drilling, completion, production, subsea, and not shown here, pipeline integrity management, pipeline and inline inspection. Today, we'll be focusing on the artificial lift reports that were recently published for ESP, rod lift, gas lift, plunger lift, progressing cavity pump, and production chemicals. Also, I'd like to share with everyone that we are working on a study right now for gas vapor management and recovery systems for tank batteries and central gathering facilities. So let us know if you'd like to participate in this important study or have a colleague in your company that would be best to talk with. Today, as we go through the artificial lift and production chemical reports, these reports are based on interviews with production engineers, production managers, artificial lift specialists, production chemical specialists, and production chemical advisors. So let's kind of get into this series of reports in which we interviewed 402 users from around the world, representing over 200 E&P oil companies during the months of July and August of 2020. These 2020 reports are a continuation of the reports that we've published each year since 2016 and provides good trend data. The reports will focus on future activity and trends, technology needs, adoption rates, operational issues, and supplier performance and competitive position by basin. So with that, we'll jump in here a little bit and get started. In the 2020 report, given the current situation with COVID and folks working remotely, we were asked to include questions that we do in most of our research relating to remote operations and automation and digital. And one of the questions that we asked in the 2020 report to the E&P operators was what % of their wells are using automation. What's interesting in North America land of the respondents that we spoke to, they indicated about 62% of their wells are currently on artificial lift automation of some sort, and that virtually, on the right-hand side of the screen, virtually no one was planning to decrease automation. It was either expected to increase or to stay at consistent levels. We did ask open-ended questions where they'd like to see improvements in their artificial lift automation. We received a great deal of great feedback, of which we posted a few of the verbatims on the right-hand side of this graph, just to provide some color and texture for what type of feedback that we're receiving. But generally speaking, the E&P operators are looking for their automation systems for artificial lift to have user-friendly interfaces that are open format so that they can use whatever business intelligence platform they wish to use, be it Power BI or TIPCO or Spotfire. And they want it to be integrated with all their systems that they can use internally as well as drive down cost. It's interesting to see one of the comments here saying about how the algorithms are advancing, but the interfaces are behind the times, and some are still using an old DOS system. When we get into the gas lift report, we do ask the operators about what % of their gas lift installations are using downhole pressure and temperature gauges. And as you can see in the United States land, about 48% of the respondents are planning to use downhole pressure temperature gauges for the gas lift installations on about 2/3 of the wells. So translated another way, about 1 in 3 gas lift installations in the United States land market today are being installed with downhole pressure and temperature sensors to help optimize the production and the performance of the gas lift system. And so when you kind of take a look at what the future business model is going to look like for production solutions, I think many of the E&P operators are really looking for some suppliers that can help solve problems for them rather than just be a pump supplier or a sucker ride supplier. And this is a future-based model where I see evolving the well data correlating and inputting with the artificial lift data and the production chemical data to use data analytics to optimize the performance of the well. And we'll talk more about that later today. I want to talk about the landscape for the use of artificial lift systems and how they've changed over the years. I think everyone on the call is probably familiar with these forms of lift. Traditionally, particularly in the United States land, about 70 to 80% of the wells that used to be on artificial lift back in 2010 or before were probably on a rod lift system. But beginning in 2015 to where we are in 2020, we saw a very rapid progression of trial and error and trial and use of hydraulic jet pumps, ESPs, gas lift, plunger lift, not so much progressing cavity pump in U.S. land. PCPs are principally used in Canada and other select international regions. When you take a look at the installed base of the wells on artificial lift in the United States land today, rather than 70 to 80% of those wells being on rod lift today, we're down to about half of the wells on rod lift and the other half of the wells on other forms of lift like gas lift, ESP, plunger lift, and so forth. And if you take a look at the operator behavior, what's typically happening today, since we're drilling about 90% unconventional wells in the United States land market, and this is on the Permian Basin, most operators do not do what we used to do back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s and early 2000s, where you would just drill the well, put it on a rod pump, and walk away and just let that well produce for the life of the well. Today, most U.S. land operators will use multiple forms of artificial lift during the life cycle of a typical well. The preponderance of operators will use 2 systems, some will use 3 systems. And so what typically happens, and it varies by basin, and we track this at Kimberlite Research, is oftentimes they'll start with a gas lift or an ESP, and they'll use these lift systems for various levels of time. Back in 2015, when people were first trialing the use of gas lift, it was envisioned that they would try it for a year or two. And then as we got into 16, 17, and 18, due to the optimization of the gas lift systems, they were able to extend the use of gas lift on U.S. land wells to as far out as 3 or 4 or even 5 years in some cases before having to eventually migrate to a rod lift pump. ESPs are typically used for shorter periods of time, but they do provide most typically higher production rates. They have high failure rates, and we'll talk about that here in a moment. We do track this by basin, however, be it the behavior in the mid-continent amongst the operators is different than that in the Rockies. And so in each basin that we track, the ability as an artificial lift supplier has really grown and expanded from just being a sucker ride supplier to a downhole pump supplier to those trusted advisors that they're capable to be technology agnostic and provide a series of artificial lift solutions to serve the E&P operators during the life cycle of the well. And we'll talk more about that later today as well. When you get into the projections of installations for United States land, and this is for new wells, what you find is due to the decline in drilling by 38-40% in U.S. land, what we find is the number of gas lift installations are down by 40-50%, and the number of ESPs are down by 30%. But interesting enough, you're actually seeing some rod lift installations actually go up during this time, and it's principally due to wells that are being converted into rod pump into rod lift that were initially drilled, completed, and placed on gas lift or other forms of lift that are eventually making it to rod lift. If you look in the Permian Basin, for example, maybe a little bit easier to see the decline in installations for ESPs and gas lift, just mainly due to the decline in the wells being drilled. And since they're the first forms of lift most commonly employed and used, they're going to be impacted. But the conversions to rod pump are continuing to take place as demonstrated earlier in the operator behavior and the life cycle of a well. What we do find, though, in these times is that the use of used, inspected, or remanufactured sucker rods and equipment is continuing to increase. So if you take a look at what happened in 2020, most basins' use of used, inspected, reconditioned rods is increasing, and this is in large measure a function of a tremendous amount of overhang of used equipment out there. You know, there's hundreds of thousands of wells in the United States land. Many of these stripper wells are being plugged and abandoned. Those surface units and those sucker rods are really being repurposed and put to use in other wells. We saw this happen again back in 17 and 18, back when folks were converting rod-lifted wells to gas-lifted wells, like in the Eagle Ford and other regions, and it was creating a surplus. What's interesting today in 2020 is we estimate that nearly two-thirds of the surface units that are being placed into use today are really used and redistributed equipment. So the E&P operators are being very resourceful and very value conscious in terms of how they go about meeting their artificial lift needs. One of the dynamics that we've seen over the last 3 to 4 years is this, this competition between what's better. Is it better to start with gas lift, or is it better to start with an ESP pump? Most operators that were looking for maximum initial production would start with an ESP pump. The problem was, if you go back to the 2019 survey and prior surveys, we were having a preponderance of users for ESPs in U.S. land. 37 to as much as 50% or more of the ESP users were experiencing ESP failures due to gas slugging, sand, solids, debris, and they were having multiple failures with their ESP pumps, just after months of being put into use. What we've seen most recently in the 2020 report is that we've seen continued advancements in the meantime between failure of the ESP pumps. To now, in the 2020 survey, we see a much greater percentage of U.S. land operators being able to extend out the life of their ESP pumps to get out to 1 year before failure. And so this is continuing to put a little bit more pressure on the use of gas lift that in many wells you're not able to produce at the similar levels of production that you can in ESP. Also, for ESPs, there's been a very aggressive commercial structure, particularly used in the Permian Basin, where the leasing of ESPs have made it more commercially attractive for operators to use an ESP for a prescribed period of time. You can see that for suppliers like ChampionX, their user base is very actively engaged in the leasing model, and you can see why Baker Hughes tends to be a little bit more active in actually selling the ESPs versus leasing ESPs. So now what I'd like to do is kind of start looking into supplier performance. For those of you that are familiar with our voice of customer surveys that we do, when we interview the E&P operators, regardless if it's for downhole sucker rods or downhole pumps or surface units, ESPs, gas lift, plunger lift, we'll ask the E&P operators a series of open-ended questions about what suppliers do they use. In this particular case, this is slides for downhole sucker rods for rod lift systems. And while maybe 15 or so sucker rod suppliers were mentioned on average, most of the E&P operators were using about 1.6, say 2 different sucker rod suppliers. And so we're able to take a look at penetration of the market, which suppliers are penetrating most deeply in the market. You can see that the private provider TRC Services, that really is a leader in remanufactured sucker rods, is continuing to grow presence in the market as E&P operators are becoming increasing use and adoption of inspected and remanufactured rods. You can see Tenaris's presence in the market growing. You can see that Champion X, formerly Dover Norris rods, very strong penetration in the market. You can see that Weatherford's penetration in the market is continuing to decline. But when we conduct the interviews with the E&P operators, we'll ask open-ended questions like, what suppliers are you using, and how are those suppliers performing on a scale of 1 to 10? And so we'll get comparative ratings of each of the suppliers' performance ratings on a scale of 1 to 10. So, hypothetically speaking, for responsiveness to needs, they may say one supplier like Champion X gets a rating of a 10 because they're awesome. They may rate another supplier with a rating of 6 on a scale of 1 to 10, saying they're not so good. And so while we get these comparative performance ratings across these 7 performance measures, responsiveness to needs, equipment quality, reliability, competency of field service personnel, technical support, availability, overall performance, and pricing competitiveness, one of the first things that you notice as an operator is there's a wide variance in performance between the very best performing suppliers and the very worst performing suppliers. And so when we translate this into the trend map from each year that we study, 16, 17, 18, 19, and 20, it looks like a lot of spaghetti just hit the wall because you got all this stuff, and you see the industry average performance line for responsiveness to needs, and then you see certain suppliers like TRC or Champion X consistently getting customer reviews from E&P operators, your peers in the industry, getting customer reviews that are consistently better than industry average. Other suppliers like Weatherford and Tenaris are consistently receiving customer reviews that are below industry average. And then you have some suppliers like Schlumberger whose performance is inconsistent. It's up, down, up, down. It just depends on the year. And so this is, again, just a visual graphic showing how not all suppliers perform the same as it relates to being responsive to your needs, providing you technical support, field service execution, the quality and the reliability of the product, pricing competitiveness. I'm going to be using this exhibit a lot in today's webinar, so I'll spend a moment to explain it. But here we graphically illustrate supplier performance on the x-axis versus pricing competitiveness or pricing strategy on the y-axis. The midpoint of this x-axis is industry average performance, and any suppliers that plot on the right-hand side of this x-axis are receiving customer reviews from the E&P operators that are better or higher than industry average. So Champion X and TRC are receiving customer reviews on all these performance measures, stating that they're performing better than the industry average. And the suppliers plotting on the left-hand side of the x-axis are receiving customer reviews that are lower than industry average. On the y-axis, the pricing axis, the midpoint is industry average pricing competitiveness. And so, as an E&P operator, you have a decision to make. Do you choose suppliers that are in the top right-hand quadrant, that they perform better than industry average? They may charge a slightly higher price than industry average, but they cost more, but they're worth it. Or do you come down here and take the lowest price supplier, like Endurance in this particular case, where if you're just going to go for 3 bids and a buy and figure a sucker rod's a sucker rod, there's no difference between one versus the other, then you just go for the lowest price. But I think one of the things I'd like to impart upon the attendees at the webinar today is going with lowest price isn't always going to give you best value. It's not always going to give you the best outcome. And so you see quite a bit of variability here for sucker rods. If we take a look at downhole pumps, you'll see that Champion X and Donan are really the top performers, and you can see that Weatherford's underperforming again for pumps, but their pricing strategies are in alignment and they fall within the fair value fairway. If you go to the surface units, if you're looking for the best price, you probably would call Liberty Lift. They're a privately held surface beam pump provider, very experienced in the field, and they tend to be the low price leader. If you're looking for the most reliable pump, you'll probably go for Lefkin. And if you're going, for Weatherford, you're going to consistently get someone whose price is on par with industry norm, but consistently underperforming. So like in the case of Weatherford, if you look at their competitive performance and position from 17 to 18 to 19 to 20, you're just seeing a continued trend of decline in performance. And so it does make a big difference. Even in suppliers that look like they plot in very similar spatial positions on the x-axis, the performance axis, if we were to use our interactive software and look at downhole pumps in United States land and did a head-to-head analysis of Champion X in red versus Endurance in blue, Endurance gets higher ratings for responsiveness to needs and price. If you do Champion X versus Weatherford, Champion X in red will beat Weatherford in every performance category based on the customer reviews, with the exception of pricing competitiveness. And so, depending upon what you're interested in, are you interested in performance? Are you interested in service? Are you interested in price? In many cases will dictate which supplier is going to deliver the best overall value for your needs. We'll move on to electric submersible pumps, or ESPs. When you look at the United States land market for ESPs, through time and history, it used to be a two-horse race between Schlumberger and Baker Hughes. But when Summit ESP was formed in the about 2015-16 time period, Summit ESP was consistently down here in this bottom right-hand quadrant. And from the year 16, 17, 18, they continue to ascend in both market size, market share, and delivering value. In fact, if you look at Summit ESP, they continue to improve. They were sold to Halliburton in 2018, and over the last 2 years, Halliburton's performance and competitive position has continued to decline to where today, you see what's on the previous slide, Halliburton and Baker Hughes are by far the market share leaders for ESPs in United States land. Between the two of them, they probably have 60+% of the market. Overall, though, Baker Hughes continues to perform below industry average while offering pricing that appears to be on par with industry norm. Halliburton's performance that used to be the envy of the market for support and service has declined to be about industry average. Some of the smaller suppliers like Extract, Boretz, and Valiant that are much smaller in size are today, their customers that use them and rate them are providing them customer review ratings that are higher than the market share leaders. Champion X is considered to be a very acceptable value and with a very good commercial structure for leasing. This is just basically showing Halliburton's competitive performance decline over the years. When you move internationally, what you see that Schlumberger and Baker Hughes are the market share leaders in the international land market. You see Halliburton and others beginning to expand their presence into the international land market to provide additional customer choice. And when you move into the offshore market, you can see that the preponderance of the business is really concentrated in the hands of Schlumberger and Baker Hughes, and Halliburton is a new entrant into this market. When we move to gas lift systems, again, just like I showed you earlier for sucker rides, and it's the same thing for ESPs, we continue to see a wide variance between the top performing gas lift suppliers and the very worst performing gas lift suppliers. So when you look at the competitive landscape in United States land for gas lift systems, here you see pretty wide variance on this x-axis, which is the performance axis. The suppliers for gas lift that are viewed as performing best and delivering the best value, based on the feedback from you, the E&P operators, or your peers in the industry, is that Flowco is probably delivering the best overall value, followed by Champion X and Liberty Lift that we spoke about earlier, independent provider for surface beam pumping units. Due to the decline in the use of rod lift that I described earlier, back in 2015-16, operators didn't drill, complete a well, and put it on rod lift. They would drill, complete the well, put it on gas lift or ESP. So in order to survive, they began to expand into other forms of lift, including jet pump and gas lift. And so they rate favorably and well, even though they're a newer entrant. Weatherford received some of the worst customer reviews for gas lift in the market, and Priority Energy, that used to be a better performer, but their performance has declined in the last 2 years. Internationally, what we find is that Schlumberger is really a market leader in terms of being viewed as the premium-based supplier in the market. They may charge a little bit more, but they deliver the best overall performance. But again, this is an example where Weatherford will consistently undercharge or charge lower prices than Schlumberger, but the performance level is not going to be the same. So as an operator, you really need to reassess what is it that you're needing from your suppliers. Are you looking for product quality? Are you looking for service? Are you just looking for lowest price? And again, when we do head-to-heads, you'll see tremendous variances in the performance of these suppliers on these performance measures, and we can go into that if that would be helpful to the group. Plunger lift. Champion X is by far the market share leader and the performance leader, hands down, and they've been consistently the performance leader really for the last 5 years in our research. Progressing cavity pumps, not used quite so much in United States land, but this is an area actually where Weatherford shows up quite well, both in North America land and in international land. Up in Canada, where PCVs are used quite heavily in SAGD, a local company, Lifting Solutions, rates favorably. Transitioning to production chemicals, this is a very important area. Virtually every E&P operator is using production chemicals. Many of the folks for production chemicals users, E&P operators, believe that they're just pouring mouse milk down the hole. Others see quite a bit of effectiveness with ensuring flow assurance of their wells. But when you look at this competitive landscape, what we find with production chemicals is there were over 50 different suppliers mentioned as being used for production chemical suppliers in the North America land market, heavily fragmented. And what we find is that these smaller independent production chemical suppliers in aggregate are really viewed as delivering a better overall value than the market share leaders. But when you get into it in more detail and you start to look at the individual names, now we didn't plot all 51 names on here because that would just be a map of dots, but what you do see is in this bottom right-hand quadrant is a host of smaller independent suppliers viewed as really delivering better overall service and customer experience and value than some of the industry leaders. But, you know, Baker Hughes and Nowco Champion, now Champion X, they have a large percentage of the market share, and they have a lot of expertise. So when you move to the international market, you can see Champion X and Baker Hughes providing great service and value, and in offshore environment as well. But what I'd like to really focus on mostly is the fact that you as an E&P operator, particularly in the United States land, as you're drilling wells, and particularly if you're a large operator, be it an Exxon, XTO, or Chevron, or Oxy, EOG, Pioneer, you know, if you have a lot of wells, then you're being impacted daily, weekly with flow assurance issues. And what we find is when we ask the users of these various artificial lift systems what breaks on your gas lift system, what breaks on your rod lift system, and then we ask them the open-ended question, what do you attribute to be the root cause for the failure? In addition to normal wear and tear, or maybe sand, solid debris, or gas slugging, what we find is that the ineffectiveness of the production chemical programs due to the ineffectiveness of the scale inhibitor, or the wax paraffin inhibitor, or the corrosion inhibitor, or H2S inhibitor, the ineffectiveness of these production chemicals is a root cause for the failure for these artificial lift systems. And so the point that we're trying to emphasize here is if you just independently select an artificial lift system and you independently select a production chemical supplier and you don't realize that the two are interrelated in some fashion, you're really kind of missing out on the fact that a lot of your failures are due to the ineffectiveness of these systems working together. You've got chemical solutions that need to be optimized. You've got mechanical solutions that need to be optimized. And if you don't do that, you're going to experience a lot of failure. We talked about in an ideal world, you would take the type of chemical and the amount of chemical in your chemical delivery system, be it capillary or through alternative means, you would deliver the chemical to where it needs to be delivered with the proper type of chemistry and the proper amount of chemistry. Today, with these wells in United States land being hydraulically fractured with a lot of sand and proppant, that's an absorbent. You also are using a tremendous amount of water that's creating all types of downhole challenges. When it comes to artificial lift, You're using multiple forms of lift that we talked about. You may start with ESP, move to gas lift, go to gas-assisted plunger, then work your way to rod lift. How you inject and set up your chemical injection systems with these various forms of lifts do matter. And then you have your production data. When you look at the effectiveness that most operators give on a scale of 1 to 10 of their production chemical systems, for everyone that gives it a high level of effectiveness rating of 9 or 10, you have almost an equal number of users giving it a rating of 6 or lower, saying that it's not effective. And if you took the ratings of 7 or lower, because 7 is not exactly a vote of endorsement, if you took the effectiveness ratings of 7 and lower, you would have more users saying that their production chemical program is not working than is working. And so we see lots of opportunity here for optimization here. If you take into account the mean time between failure for rod lift systems and for ESP systems, and here we're showing, and this is an improvement from prior years, by the way, but you've got 27% of the respondents saying that their rod lift systems are going to fail within a year. So if you think about it, if you have 1,000 wells on rod lift out in the Permian Basin, you're going to have about every other day a rod lift system going down. And so with most of the operators are telling us in our production chemical studies is that they need the production chemical suppliers to better engage their resources in the areas of technical support and problem solving to proactively identify and solve the problems that they're experiencing up here that I shared with you here on this slide right here, versus simply being reactive and ineffective in bringing about successful outcomes in the field. And really, in order for this to happen, you, the operator, are going to have to work with your suppliers to be able to drive technologies to the field to assist these field service technicians to diagnose the problems in the field, rather than relying on sending these samples to the laboratory where it could take weeks or even months to get a lab analysis back. That just prolongs your ability to diagnose and solve these problems when you may be having 5 or 10 wells going down each week if you have a very large installed base. Incorporating the automation and the data analytics and the digital solutions is the only way you're going to be able to remotely optimize your field operations and really diagnose these wells more effectively, given the velocity of failure and given the volume in which we're manufacturing these wells in the field. When you start to take a look at what's happening in the competitive landscape, however, Baker Hughes just sold off their rod lift business, Lufkin, to a private equity company in New York. And Baker Hughes is largely an ESP provider with an excellent chemical company. It's going to be really hard for them to come in and be your total production solutions provider, because if you need a jet pump, if you need a gas lift, if you need a plunger lift, or you need a rod lift system, they're not going to be your guy to go to. They have basically ESP systems. Schlumberger's in the process of selling off their rod lift business, and I'm not sure about their PCP business, but again, they're going to principally be an ESP company in U.S. land. Weatherford has multiple forms of lift. They don't have ESP. They don't have chemicals. The formation of ChampionX, which is the coming together of Nalco Champion and Apergy, they're really the only company out there that possess on paper the capabilities to put together a fully integrated production solution offering with both chemical solutions and with artificial lift solutions. So I guess they may be one of the last great hopes for the U.S. market if they can pull it together to do that. So as an operator, I would encourage you to work with your suppliers, and particularly if you use ChampionX, to encourage them to accelerate the digitization of their business, leveraging the XBOC automation platform to include production chemicals and other forms of lift, so that you have a common platform that you can use that's open. Weatherford has good automation in the field, and Lufkin has good automation in the field. If you take a look at Baker Hughes, they have very good production chemical programs for scale, corrosion, and wax. So does ChampionX. And so when you start to take a look at where your solution sets could be, you're going to be looking for these operators that can provide hopefully more than just one form of lift, that can provide hopefully mechanical solutions and chemical solutions. Otherwise, you as an operator, you may have to go off there and interface with 5 or 6 suppliers to get what you need. Maybe you call Tenaris for sucker rod, Endurance for downhole pump, Lufkin for the surface unit, Weatherford for their Foresight automation platform, NOCO Champion for their chemicals. And when you have a failure, you're going to have to get all 5 counterparties to the table and try to sort out what's going on. Probably not going to happen. And lastly, I'll probably close with, again, you have to take a look at what you're interested in. Are you interested in performance? Are you interested in service? Are you interested in price? Because it does make a difference. Just for example, if you take a look at that simple beam pumping unit, if you want best price, you probably should call Liberty. You want best performance, you probably need to call Lufkin. In every product line that we research, there is a difference between suppliers that perform best in various areas. Some suppliers are best in customer experience and service and responsiveness. Other suppliers may have some of the best designed and reliable equipment. Other suppliers may offer you the very best price. And so at this point, I'm going to check and see if there's any questions that we need to address. Okay. So it looks like we're okay on questions. I'm trying to be respectful of everyone's time. What I would encourage you to do as an E&P operator, if there's a particular product line which you're trying to evaluate what the competitive landscape looks like for suppliers, feel free to reach out. We'll be glad to help you. We recognize the challenge that you're under. When you go out for bid, you can rate the performance of suppliers' bids based on their pricing competitiveness levels, but it becomes very difficult to rate the performance of the suppliers on their performance. And so, and for those of you that participate in our surveys, we thank you for your gift of feedback. It allows us to benchmark supplier performance. It allows us to calibrate what is normal performance and what's not normal performance. And performance levels and expectations and benchmarks change from that being from like the Permian Basin to the Marcellus to the Bakken to the Eagle Ford. And the competitive landscapes do change by basin. If I were to go in just really quick before I wrap it up and say we're going to go in interactively, say, into the Permian Basin, which is a big basin, and we'll take a look at downhole pumps. You can see how the competitive landscape for downhole pumps looks a little bit different in the Permian Basin. If we were to go in and focus on downhole pumps and you're only interested in a supplier that gave you, 100% the best customer responsiveness and service, and you didn't really care about the other criteria in the selection process, you could very quickly begin to see how this competitive landscape is going to change depending upon what you're emphasizing in the Permian Basin. If you wanted it to be 100% equipment quality and reliability, you can begin to see how the competitive landscape begins to change. And that's the things that we see with all the product lines that we research. And so with that, unless there's any questions, I want to thank you for attending. We welcome your feedback on how to improve these webinars and information that we can provide to you that will help you in your business decision making. And with that, we'll sign off here from Kimberlite. Thank you very much.